Elena Vasquez was 12 years old when she first looked through a telescope and saw the rings of Saturn. And from that moment she knew that she would spend her life searching the stars for something more than rocks and gas clouds floating in the emptiness of space. She grew up in a small town in Argentina where the nights were dark and the sky was filled with more stars than anyone could count in a lifetime. And every night she would climb onto the roof of her family's house and stare upward, wondering if somewhere out there someone was staring back at her. Her parents told her she was a dreamer, and her teachers said she needed to focus on practical things. But Elena never listened to any of them because she knew, deep in her heart, that the universe was too big and too old, contain only one thinking species on one small blue planet. She studied hard and earned scholarships, and eventually found herself working at the Atacama Array in Chile, a collection of massive radio dishes pointed at the heavens, listening for signals that most people believed would never come. For 30 years she sat in control rooms and analyzed data and wrote papers that few people read, and she watched younger scientists come and go, many of them giving up after a few years of hearing nothing but the natural hum of the cosmos. Her colleagues called her obsessed, and her friends worried that she was wasting her life. But Elena kept listening because she understood something that others did not, which was that the universe operated on timescales that made human lifetimes seem like the blink of an eye. Then on a quiet Tuesday morning in the year 2047, everything changed forever. Elena was drinking her third cup of coffee and reviewing the previous night's data when she noticed something strange in the signal patterns. A repeating sequence that did not match any natural phenomenon she had ever seen. At first, she thought it was a mistake or interference from a satellite or some kind of equipment malfunction. So she ran the data through every filter and test she could think of. And each time the result was the same. The signal was real, and it was structured, and it was repeating in prime number sequences, which was exactly the kind of pattern that scientists had always said would indicate intelligent origin, because prime numbers are universal mathematical concepts that any advanced civilization would understand. Elena's hands were shaking as she called her supervisor and then the director. And then within hours the entire facility was in chaos as more and more people crowded into the control room to see the data for themselves. The news spread faster than anyone could control it. And within days the whole world knew that humanity was no longer alone in the universe. Some people celebrated in the streets, while others prayed in churches and mosques and temples. And governments held emergency meetings and military forces went on high alert. But Elena just kept working, trying to decode the message that was coming from a star system called Kepler 442, about 100 light-years away. The signal was complex and layered, and it took teams of mathematicians and linguists and computer scientists working together for months to begin understanding its structure. And what they found was remarkable. It appeared to be a greeting of some kind, a mathematical introduction that established basic concepts and then built upon them to create a simple vocabulary, almost like a primer designed to teach a foreign language to a student who knew nothing. The world came together in a way that Elena had never seen before, with old enemies setting aside their differences and nations pooling their resources, all united by the knowledge that something bigger than any human conflict was now demanding their attention. The Earth Council was formed within a year, a global governing body that represented all of humanity in matters relating to the alien contact. And Elena was appointed as the lead scientist in charge of the response team. They debated for months about what to send back, with some arguing for caution and others pushing for immediate and enthusiastic response. And eventually, they settled on a message that included mathematical concepts, images of Earth and its life forms, samples of human music and art, and expressions of peaceful intent. The transmission was sent on December 12, 2048. beamed toward Kepler 442 with all the power that humanity could muster. And then the waiting began. Elena knew that even at the speed of light, a response would take at least 200 years to arrive. Assuming the aliens received the message and chose to reply, so she settled in for the long wait, training younger scientists to continue the work after she was gone. But the universe had other plans. Just 3 years after sending their message, something unexpected happened that made Elena realize just how little humans understood about what they were dealing with. The original signal from Kepler 442 suddenly stopped, cutting off mid-sequence as if someone had flipped a switch, and no matter how hard the team searched, they could not find any trace of it anywhere in the electromagnetic spectrum. Some scientists suggested that the source had simply moved out of range or that the aliens had finished their broadcast. But Elena felt a cold knot forming in her stomach because the abruptness of the silence felt wrong somehow. She tried to tell herself that she was being paranoid and that there were countless natural explanations for what had happened. But late at night, when she was alone in the control room, she could not shake the feeling that something had changed. The world moved on, and people went back to their normal lives. Still excited about the discovery, but no longer watching the news every day for updates. And governments began to reduce funding for the listening programs, because there was nothing new to report. Elena refused to give up, and she kept the remaining dishes pointed at Kepler 442, listening for any hint of the signal's return. And her persistence was about to be rewarded in ways she never could have imagined, because 6 months after the signal stopped, the probes arrived. They came without warning. Small metallic spheres that descended through Earth's atmosphere and took up positions over major cities around the world, hovering silently and watching with sensors that human scientists could not even begin to understand. Elena stood on the roof of the facility and watched one of the spheres hanging in the sky above the nearest city. And she felt tears running down her face because this was the moment she had dreamed of her entire life. First contact had arrived, and she was there to witness it. And she believed with all her heart that humanity was about to take its first steps into a larger and more wonderful universe than anyone had ever imagined. She had no way of knowing how terribly wrong she was. The probes hung in the sky like metal moons, silent and patient and completely unresponsive to every attempt at communication that humanity could devise. Elena and her team tried everything they could think of, sending radio signals and laser pulses and mathematical sequences, broadcasting greetings in every human language, and even trying the same format as the original alien transmission. But the spheres simply floated there and watched. They were about the size of small houses, perfectly smooth and silver in color, with no visible openings or markings or any indication of how they moved or what powered them. And they reflected sunlight so brightly that they were visible even during the day. Scientists from every nation worked together to study them, using telescopes and radar and every instrument available. And what they learned was both fascinating and troubling. The spheres were scanning everything, sending invisible beams of energy down to the surface that penetrated buildings and earth and water, mapping every inch of the planet in incredible detail. They cataloged mineral deposits and water sources and forests and farmland. And they paid particular attention to areas with high concentrations of certain rare elements that were valuable for advanced technology. Elena noticed that they seemed especially interested in human population centers, recording the locations and sizes of cities and the movements of people within them, almost like someone taking inventory of livestock on a farm. She tried to push that thought out of her mind because it was too disturbing to consider, and she focused instead on the exciting possibility that the aliens were simply trying to understand Earth before making formal contact. The Earth Council met in emergency session every day, debating how to respond to the silent visitors, and opinions were divided between those who wanted to take aggressive action and those who counsel patience and diplomacy. Elena argued passionately for patience, reminding everyone that these beings had traveled across the stars to reach Earth and that they deserved time to complete whatever survey they were conducting before being pressured into communication. She pointed out that human scientists would probably do the same thing if they discovered a primitive planet full of life, studying it thoroughly before attempting contact to avoid accidentally causing harm. Her arguments won the day, and the Earth Council issued a directive ordering all military forces to stand down and allow the probes to continue their work unmolested. Months passed and the spheres kept scanning, moving slowly from region to region in a methodical pattern that covered every corner of the globe. Elena spent her days analyzing the data they were collecting about the probes themselves, trying to understand their technology and maybe find some way to communicate with whatever intelligence controlled them. She discovered that the spheres were connected to each other through some kind of quantum link, sharing information instantly across vast distances in a way that human physics said should be impossible. This meant they were not operating independently, but were instead part of a larger network, probably connected to a ship or station somewhere beyond Earth's detection range. The thought should have been exciting, proof of incredibly advanced technology that humanity might someday learn to use. But something about it made Elena uneasy. The way the probes moved, the systematic nature of their survey, the complete lack of any attempt at communication despite all of humanity's efforts. It all reminded her of something she could not quite place. Then, one night, while she was reading an old book about European explorers arriving in the Americas, it hit her with the force of a physical blow. The aliens were not studying Earth out of scientific curiosity or preparing for peaceful first contact. They were surveying it, measuring its resources, cataloging its assets, exactly the way colonial powers had surveyed new territories before moving in to exploit them. Elena tried to convince herself that she was wrong, that she was letting fear cloud her judgment, but the more she thought about it, the more sense it made. Why else would they focus so much attention on mineral deposits and water sources and population centers, unless they were planning to take those things for themselves? She brought her concerns to the Earth Council, presenting her analysis and begging them to reconsider their passive approach. But the leaders dismissed her fears as paranoid speculation. They reminded her that she had spent her whole life dreaming of alien contact and suggested that she was simply overwhelmed by the reality of the situation. Elena left the meeting feeling frustrated and helpless, knowing in her gut that something terrible was coming, but unable to make anyone listen. 2 weeks later, the probes began to rise, climbing higher and higher into the atmosphere until they passed beyond the reach of human observation and vanished into the darkness of space. The world waited in tense silence for days, watching the skies and wondering what would happen next. Some people celebrated, believing that the survey was complete, and that the aliens would now send ambassadors to begin formal diplomatic relations. Others worried that the departure meant humanity had somehow failed a test and been found unworthy of contact. Elena said nothing publicly, but privately she prepared for the worst, reaching out to old friends in military and scientific communities and urging them to be ready for anything. She knew that her warnings sounded crazy to most people, who saw the alien visit as the greatest moment in human history, a sign that the universe was full of wonders waiting to be discovered. But Elena had spent her life studying the cosmos, and she understood something that the optimists did not want to accept. The universe was not a friendly place, and survival rarely came to those who were not prepared to fight for it. 6 months after the probes departed, Elena was working late in her office when alarms began sounding across the facility. She ran to the control room and stared at the screens in horror as new objects appeared in Earth's orbit. Massive ships that dwarfed anything humanity had ever built. They were not spheres this time, but vast industrial structures, covered with machinery and cargo bays and what looked terribly like weapons. The ships took up positions around the planet, surrounding Earth like predators circling wounded prey. Elena watched the screens and felt her heart breaking as she understood that her worst fears had come true. The silence before the storm was over, and humanity was about to learn exactly what kind of universe they lived in. The first ships descended over Jakarta on a bright morning when children were walking to school and workers were filling the streets on their way to offices and factories. They came down slowly, blocking out the sun and casting shadows that stretched for miles. And people stopped what they were doing and stared upward with a mixture of wonder and fear. The Earth Council broadcast emergency messages on every channel, urging calm and reminding citizens that humanity was ready to welcome their interstellar visitors with open arms and peaceful intentions. Diplomats prepared speeches and scientists readied their instruments, and the whole world held its breath, waiting for the historic moment when two civilizations would finally meet face to face. But the aliens had no interest in speeches or handshakes or cultural exchange. Without any warning or announcement, the ships opened their cargo bays and released machines that descended on the city like a swarm of metal locusts. These machines were not weapons in the traditional sense. They were tools, designed for one purpose only, and that purpose was extraction. They tore into buildings and ripped up roads and dug deep into the earth, pulling out metal and minerals and anything else of value, loading it into containers that were lifted back up to the waiting ships. People ran screaming through the streets as their homes and businesses collapsed around them, and those who could not escape were simply swept aside like debris. Not deliberately killed, but not protected either. The machines did not distinguish between a concrete building and a human body, treating both as obstacles to be cleared in the pursuit of resources within hours. Large sections of Jakarta had been reduced to rubble, and the death toll was climbing into the tens of thousands. The Earth Council finally authorized military response, sending fighter jets and missiles and everything else they could muster against the invaders. It was hopeless from the start. The alien ships had defensive systems that made Earth's weapons look like toys, shooting down missiles before they could get close and disabling aircraft, with energy pulses that left the pilots alive but unable to control their machines. Ground forces attempted to attack the extraction machines directly, but they were protected by smaller drones that responded to threats with precise and lethal force. Soldiers who got too close were simply eliminated. Their weapons melted and their bodies left where they fell as the machines continued their work without pause. Elena watched the footage from a bunker deep beneath the Atacama facility, tears streaming down her face as she saw her hopes for peaceful contact die in fire and rubble. The beings behind this attack, whoever or whatever they were, had not come to trade or negotiate or share knowledge. They had come to take what they wanted, and they did not care how many humans died in the process. Over the following weeks, more ships arrived and more cities were targeted, always appearing without warning and always focusing on areas rich in the resources they wanted. They seemed to have perfect knowledge of where everything was located, thanks to the survey conducted by the probes, and they moved with cold efficiency from one extraction site to the next. The death toll climbed past 100 million as infrastructure collapsed across the affected regions. Power grids failed and water systems broke down, and hospitals ran out of supplies. And people died not from direct alien attack, but from the chaos that followed in its wake. Survivors gave the aliens a name, calling them the Collectors, because that seemed to be exactly what they were. Cosmic scavengers moving from world to world and taking everything of value. Elena studied every piece of data she could gather about them, trying to understand their technology and their methods, and maybe find some weakness that could be exploited. What she learned only deepened her despair. The collectors operated with a level of technological sophistication that was thousands of years beyond anything humanity had achieved. Their ships could travel faster than light, and their machines could harvest resources at rates that defied human engineering. And their defensive systems were so advanced that even nuclear weapons might not be able to penetrate them. Worse still, they seemed to have no central command or decision-making structure that could be targeted or negotiated with. The extraction machines operated autonomously, following programmed instructions that had probably been set long before they arrived at Earth. There was no king to petition or parliament to address or military commander to challenge, just an endless swarm of machines doing exactly what they had been designed to do. The Earth Council fragmented as governments fell and leaders died or fled. And what had briefly been a united humanity dissolved back into chaos and fear. Some regions tried to surrender, broadcasting messages of submission and offering to cooperate with the extraction in exchange for protection. But the collectors did not respond because they did not need cooperation. They simply took what they wanted and moved on, leaving devastated landscapes and broken populations behind them. Elena found herself working with a loose network of survivors who refused to give up. Scientists and soldiers and ordinary people who believed that there had to be some way to fight back. They operated from hidden locations, sharing information through encrypted channels and gathering every scrap of intelligence they could about the alien technology. It was during one of these information sharing sessions that Elena met General Marcus Chun, a man whose family had died in the Jakarta attack and whose eyes held a cold fury that matched her own despair. Chun had been one of the highest-ranking officers in the old military structure, and he had spent the months since the invasion studying the collectors and planning for the day when humanity would strike back. He did not speak of defense or survival. He spoke of revenge, of making the collectors pay for every human life they had taken. Elena should have been troubled by the rage in his voice, but she found herself drawn to it instead. The woman who had spent her life dreaming of peaceful contact with alien civilizations was gone, replaced by someone who understood that the universe was not kind and that survival sometimes required becoming something terrible. When Chun asked her to join his team and help develop weapons that could hurt the collectors, she did not hesitate. The harvesting had broken something inside her, something that could only be repaired by making the ones responsible suffer for what they had done. She said yes, and in that moment she took the first step on a path that would lead to the most devastating act of destruction the galaxy had ever known. 18 months after the first ships appeared over Jakarta, the world Elena had known was gone forever. 2 billion people were dead. Not from weapons or battles, but from the slow collapse of everything that had kept civilization running. The collectors had not set out to kill humanity. They simply did not care whether humans lived or died. And their extraction operations had destroyed so much infrastructure that the systems keeping people alive began to fail one by one. Power plants went dark. When the machines tore up the mines that supplied their fuel water, treatment facilities collapsed when the pipes carrying their chemicals were ripped from the ground. Farms became wastelands when the irrigation systems were dismantled for the metals they contained, and hospitals became morgues when there was no electricity, no medicine, and no way to transport the sick and injured to safety. Elena moved constantly, traveling from one hidden refuge to another, always one step ahead of the extraction machines that were slowly consuming the planet. She had become thin and tired and years older than her actual age, her hair turning gray and her eyes developing dark circles that never went away. But she refused to stop working, spending every waking hour analyzing collector technology and searching for any weakness that could be exploited. General Chun had established a network of underground bases, carved out of mountains and hidden beneath cities and scattered across every continent. These bases were connected by encrypted communication channels that the collectors seemed unable to detect, allowing survivors to share information and coordinate their efforts. The Resistance, as they called themselves, numbered perhaps 50,000 active members, a tiny fraction of the billions who had died. But they were determined and resourceful, and utterly committed to finding a way to fight back. Chun drove them hard, demanding progress and punishing failure. And some people whispered that he had become as cold as the machines they were fighting against. But Elena understood him better than most, because she saw the same transformation happening inside herself. Every day brought new reports of atrocities. Cities leveled and refugee camps scattered, and children dying from diseases that should have been easily treatable. And every day the rage inside her grew stronger, burning away the gentle scientist she had once been and replacing her with something harder and darker. It was during this period of despair that Elena made the discovery that would change everything. She was analyzing intercepted collector communications, trying to understand how their machines coordinated their activities across such vast distances. The signals were encrypted in ways that human computers could not break. But the patterns themselves revealed something important about how the system worked. Every collector machine, from the smallest drone to the largest ship, was connected to a central network that spanned their entire civilization. This network used quantum entanglement to transmit information instantly across light years, allowing machines in different star systems to share data and receive instructions without any delay. Elena realized that this network was both the collector's greatest strength and their most dangerous vulnerability, because everything was connected. The network allowed for incredible coordination and efficiency, with resources allocated perfectly and operations synchronized across dozens of worlds. But because everything was connected, a single point of failure could bring the entire system crashing down. If someone could introduce a malicious program into the network, it would spread instantly to every connected device. With no way to contain the infection or limit the damage, Elena spent weeks studying the network structure, mapping its pathways and analyzing its security protocols. What she found amazed her, because the collectors had not bothered to build any defenses against external attack. Their security was based entirely on the assumption that no other species could understand their technology well enough to threaten it. They had been harvesting worlds for thousands of years, and no one had ever managed to hurt them. So they had stopped worrying about the possibility. It was arrogance of a kind that Elena had never imagined. The absolute certainty that they were beyond challenge, and it was exactly the weakness she had been searching for. She brought her findings to General Chun in a meeting that lasted through the night, explaining the network and its vulnerabilities in terms that even a non-scientist could understand. Chun listened without interrupting, his face revealing nothing of his thoughts. And when Elena finished, he sat in silence for a long time. Then he asked her a question that cut through all the technical details and went straight to the heart of the matter. He asked her if she could build a weapon that would destroy not just the ships in Earth's orbit, but the entire collector civilization. Elena hesitated because the scope of what he was suggesting was almost too large to comprehend. They were talking about killing potentially trillions of beings across dozens of star systems, wiping out an entire species in a single stroke. She thought about the ethical implications and the moral weight of such an action and the way history would judge them if they succeeded. And then she thought about the children dying in refugee camps and the cities turned to rubble and the 2 billion people who would never see another sunrise. She looked Chun in the eye and told him yes, she could build such a weapon, and she would do it from that moment forward. The Resistance had a single purpose: not just to survive or to push back the collectors, but to destroy them so completely that they would never threaten anyone again. They called the project Prometheus, after the Greek titan who stole fire from the gods, because that was exactly what they intended to do. They would take the collectors' own technology and turn it against them, using their network to deliver a blow so devastating that the cosmos itself would feel the impact. Elena threw herself into the work with a dedication that bordered on obsession, sleeping only when her body refused to continue and eating only when others forced food into her hands. She led a team of the brightest surviving scientists, each of them driven by the same mixture of grief and rage that burned inside her. They made mistakes and suffered setbacks and lost colleagues to collector attacks, but they never stopped moving forward because they understood something that the collectors had never considered. Humanity might be weak and primitive and easy to harvest, but when pushed far enough, when broken completely and left with nothing to lose, humans were capable of things that more advanced species could not imagine. The breaking point had been reached, and what emerged from the wreckage was something the universe had never seen before: a species willing to do absolutely anything to survive, and absolutely anything to make its enemies pay. The main base of operations was buried deep beneath the Swiss Alps, carved into the mountain by machines that had been designed for mining, but repurposed for survival. General Chun had chosen the location carefully, knowing that the collectors had little interest in the region because its mineral deposits were not valuable enough to justify extraction. It was a bitter irony that humanity's last hope existed only because the aliens considered it worthless. The base housed nearly 3,000 people, scientists and engineers and soldiers and support staff, all working toward a single goal under conditions that would have broken weaker spirits. The tunnels were cold and damp, and the lighting was dim to conserve power. And fresh food was a distant memory, replaced by recycled nutrients and vitamin supplements. But morale remained high because everyone understood what they were fighting for, and because they believed in Elena and Chun and the mission they had been given. Elena had set up her laboratory in a converted storage chamber, filling it with salvaged collector technology and improvised equipment built from whatever materials could be scavenged. She spent her days surrounded by alien machines, taking them apart piece by piece and studying their components with a patience that amazed even her most dedicated colleagues. The collectors built their technology with a precision that exceeded anything human engineers had ever achieved. And understanding it required learning an entirely new way of thinking about physics and materials and energy. Elena approached the challenge like a puzzle, finding satisfaction in each small breakthrough, even as the larger picture remained frustratingly incomplete. She developed a team of specialists, each focused on a different aspect of the alien technology, and together they made progress that would have seemed impossible just a year earlier. They learned how the quantum communication network functioned, tracing its pathways and mapping its architecture with painstaking detail. They discovered how the collector machines processed information, using organic computing, elements that blended biology with electronics in ways that human science had only theorized about. And most importantly, they figured out how to access the network without being detected, slipping their sensors into the data streams like invisible parasites. General Chun managed the military side of the operation, maintaining discipline and security while coordinating with resistance cells around the world. He had aged visibly since the invasion began, his hair gone completely white and his face lined with stress and grief. But his mind remained sharp and his will remained iron. And he inspired a loyalty in his soldiers that bordered on devotion. Chun understood something that many military leaders did not, which was that winning a war required more than just weapons and tactics. It required a reason to fight that was stronger than the fear of death. He gave his people that reason by reminding them constantly of what they had lost and what they were fighting to protect. Every soldier under his command knew the names of the dead, recited them in mourning assemblies like prayers, keeping the memory of the fallen alive so that their sacrifice would never be forgotten. The resistance operated in secrecy, avoiding any action that might draw collector attention to their hiding places. They watched, and they waited, and they learned, gathering intelligence about enemy movements and operations while preparing for the day when they would finally strike back. Small teams ventured out on scavenging missions, recovering collector technology from crash sites and abandoned extraction zones, bringing back the components that Elena needed for her research. These missions were dangerous because the alien drones patrolled constantly, and more than a few teams never returned, but there was never a shortage of volunteers because everyone understood that the mission was more important than any individual life. Elena formed an unlikely friendship during these dark months with a young engineer named Yuki Tanaka, who had survived the destruction of Tokyo and made her way to the resistance through sheer determination. Yuki was brilliant and creative and possessed a sense of humor that seemed out of place in such grim circumstances, but Elena found her presence comforting. They worked side by side for hours at a time, discussing technical problems and sharing memories of the world that had been lost and dreaming of the future they hoped to build. Yuki never asked about the ethical implications of their work, perhaps because she had seen too much death to worry about abstract principles, but Elena thought about it constantly. Lying awake at night and staring at the stone ceiling above her bunk, she was building a weapon of mass destruction, a device designed to kill on a scale that made nuclear bombs look like fireworks. The fact that it was aimed at aliens who had murdered billions did not change the fundamental nature of what she was doing. She was becoming a killer, and no amount of justification could erase that truth. But then she would think about the refugee camps and the ruined cities and the children who had died because the collectors wanted their planet's resources, and she would get out of bed and return to her laboratory and continue working. The months stretched into years, and the weapon slowly took shape. Elena called it the Hymn, a name that struck some as strange for something designed to bring death on such a massive scale. But she chose it deliberately because she thought of the code as a song, a sequence of instructions that would spread through the collector network like music through an orchestra. Each note would trigger the next in perfect harmony, cascading through systems and subsystems until the entire network was singing the same deadly tune. The hymn was elegant in its simplicity, using the collector's own technology against them in ways they had never anticipated. It would infiltrate their systems silently, copying itself to every connected device and lying dormant until the moment of activation. And when that moment came, it would turn their machines against them, opening airlocks and venting atmospheres and triggering catastrophic failures in every system it touched. Elena tested the code on captured collector devices, watching in satisfaction as they tore themselves apart in response to her commands. But testing on isolated machines was very different from deploying against an interconnected civilization. There would be only one chance to use the hymn, and if anything went wrong, the collectors would learn of Earth's capabilities and adjust their defenses accordingly. The resistance would not get a second attempt. Chun pushed for early deployment, arguing that every day they waited meant more human deaths. But Elena insisted on perfection. She would not release the hymn until she was absolutely certain it would work. And so the quiet resistance continued, hidden beneath the mountains, preparing in secret for the moment when humanity would show the universe exactly what it was capable of. The collectors continued their harvest, oblivious to the threat growing in the shadows. They had no reason to suspect that the primitive species they were processing could possibly pose any danger. It was a mistake that would cost them everything.